The results obtained by laying on this journey only fired his ambition for further discoveries. He, therefore, determined to make his way to Timbuktu. On the 17th June, 1825, he embarked at Malta for Tripoli, where he joined a caravan with which Hatita, the Tuareg chief who had made such friends with Lion, was also travelling as far as Got. After 2 months' halt at Ghadames, laying again started in October and reached Insala, which he places a good deal further west than his predecessors had done. Here he remained from November 1825 to January 1826, and then made his way to the Wadi Got, intending to go from thence at once to Timbuktu, making a tour of Lake Jenne or Debi, visiting the Meli country and tracing the Niger to its mouth. He would then have retraced his steps as far as Sakatu, visited Lake Tichad and attempted to reach the hill. Outside Got, the caravan with which Lane was travelling was attacked, some say by Tuaregs, others by Berber Arabs, a tribe living near the Niger. Lane, says Cayley, who got his information at Timbuktu, was recognized as a Christian and horribly ill-treated. He was beaten with a stick until he was left for dead. I suppose that the other Christian whom they told me was beaten to death was one of the major's servants. The Moors of Lane's caravan picked him up, and succeeded by dint of great care in recalling him to life. So soon as he regained consciousness, he was placed on his camel, to which he had to be tied. He was too weak to be able to sit up. The robbers had left him nothing, the greater part of his baggage had been rifled. Lane arrived at Timbuktu on the 18th August, 1826 and recovered from his wounds. His convalescence was slow, but he was fortunately spared the extortions of the natives, owing to the letters of introduction he had brought with him from Tripoli and to the sedulous care of his host, a native of that city. According to Cayley, who quotes this remarkable fact from an old native, Lane retained his European costume, and gave out that he had been sent by his master, the King of England, to visit Timbuktu and describe the wonders it contained. It appears, adds the French traveller, that Lane drew the plan of the city in public, for the same Moor told me in his naive and expressive language that he had written the town and everything in it. After a careful examination of Timbuktu, Lane, who had good reason to fear the Tuaregs, paid a visit by night to Cabra and looked down on the waters of the Niger. Instead of returning to Europe by way of the Great Desert, he was very anxious to go past Jenne and Sigo to the French settlements in Senegal, but at the first hint of his purpose to the foolers who crowded to stare at him, he was told that a Nazarene could not possibly be allowed to set foot in their country, and that if he dared attempt it they would make him repent it. Lane was, therefore, driven to go by way of El Arawan, where he hoped to join a caravan of Moorish merchants taking salt to Sansending. But 5 days after he left Timbuktu, his caravan was joined by a fanatic sheikh, named Hamdud Habib, chief of the Zawat tribe, and Lane was at once arrested under pretense of his having entered their country without authorization. The major, being urged to profess Mohammedanism, refused, preferring death to apostasy. A discussion then took place between the sheikh and his hired assassins as to how the victim should be put to death, and finally Lane was strangled by 2 slaves. His body was left unburied in the desert. This was all Cayley was able to find out when he visited Timbuktu, but 1 year after Major Lane's death. We have supplemented his accounts by a few details gathered from the reports of the Royal Geographical Society, for the traveller's journal and the notes he took are alike lost to us. We have already told how Lane managed to fix pretty accurately the position of the sources of the Niger. We have also described the efforts made by Mungo Park and Clapperton to trace the middle portion of the course of that river. We have now to narrate the journeys made in order to examine its mouth and the lower part of its course. The earliest and most successful was that of Richard Lander, formerly Clapperton's servant. Richard Lander and his brother John proposed to the English government that they should be sent to explore the Niger to its mouth. Their offer was accepted, and they embarked on a government vessel for Badagry, where they arrived on the 19th March, 1830. The king of the country, Aduli, of whom Richard Lander retained a friendly remembrance, was in low spirits. His town had just been burnt, his generals and his best soldiers had perished in a battle with the people of Lagos, and he himself had had a narrow escape when his house and all his treasures were destroyed by fire. He determined to retrieve his losses, and to do so at the expense of the travellers, who could not get permission to penetrate into the interior of the country until they had been robbed of their most valuable merchandise, and compelled to sign drafts in payment for a gunboat with 100 men, for 2 puncheons of rum, 20 barrels of powder, and a large quantity of merchandise, which they knew perfectly well would never be delivered by this monarch, who was as greedy of gain as he was drunken. As a matter of course, the natives followed the example of their chief, vied with him in selfishness, greed, and meanness, regarded the English as fair spoil, and fleeced them on every opportunity. At last, on the 31st March, Richard and John Lander succeeded in getting away from Badagry, and preceded by an escort sent in advance by the king, arrived at Katanga on the 13th May, having halted by the way at Wauwau, a good-sized town Biji where Pierce and Morrison had been taken ill. Jene Chao Ega, all towns visited by Clapperton and Gua, where Pierce died. Asinara, the first walled city they saw. Bohu, formerly capital of Yariba, Jaguta, Liaguada and Icho, where there is a famous market. Lower course of the Niger after Lander. At Katanga, according to custom, the travellers halted under a tree before they were received by the king, but being tired of waiting, they presently went to the residence of Ebo, the chief eunuch, and the most influential man about the person of the sovereign. A diabolical noise of cymbals, trumpets and drums, all played together, announced the approach of the white men, and Mansala, the king, gave them a most hearty welcome, ordering Ebo to behead everyone who should molest them. The Landers, fearful of being detained by Mansala until the rainy season, acted on Ebo's advice, and said nothing about the Niger, but merely spoke of the death of their fellow countryman at Bausa 20 years before, adding that the King of England had sent them to the Sultan of Yayuri to recover his papers. Although Mansala did not treat the brothers Lander quite as graciously as he had treated Clapperton, he allowed them to go 8 days after their arrival. Of the many details given in the original account of the Landers' journey, of Katanga and the province of Yariba, we will only quote the following. Katanga has by no means answered the expectations we had been led to form of it, either as regards its prosperity or the number of its inhabitants. The vast plain on which it stands, although exceedingly fine, yields in verdure and fertility, and simple beauty of appearance, to the delightful country surrounding the less celebrated city of Bohu. Its market is tolerably well supplied with provisions, which are, however, exceedingly dear, insomuch that, with the exception of disgusting insects, reptiles, and vermin, the lower classes of the people are almost unacquainted with the taste of animal food. Mansala's carelessness and the imbecile cowardice of his subjects had enabled the Felatas to establish themselves in Yariba, to entrench themselves in its fortified towns, and to obtain the recognition of their independence, until they became sufficiently strong to assume an absolute sovereignty over the whole country. From Katanga the Landers travelled to Borgu by way of Atupa, Bumbum, a town much frequented by the merchants of Hausa, Borgu, and other provinces trading with Ganya, Kishi, on the frontiers of Yariba, and Mausa, on the river of the same name, beyond which they were met by an escort sent to join them by the Sultan of Borgu. Sultan Yaro received them with many expressions of pleasure and kindness, showing special delight at seeing Richard Lander again. Although he was a convert to Mohammedanism, Yaro evidently put more faith in the superstitions of his forefathers than in his new creed. Fetishes and grygris were hung over his door, and in one of his huts there was a square stool, supported on 2 sides by 4 little wooden effigies of men. The character, manners, and costumes of the people of Borgu differ essentially from those of the natives of Yariba. Perhaps no two people in the universe residing so near each other, says the narrative, differ more widely than the natives of Yariba and Borgu. The former are perpetually engaged in trading with each other from town to town, the latter never quit their towns except in case of war, or when engaged in predatory excursions. The former are pusillanimous and cowardly, the latter are bold and courageous, full of spirit and energy, and never seem happier than when engaged in martial exercises. The former are generally mild, unassuming, humble and honest, but cold and passionless. The latter are proud and haughty, too vain to be civil and too shrewd to be honest, yet they appear to understand somewhat of the nature of love and the social affections, are warm in their attachments and keen in their resentments. On the 17th June, our travellers at last came in sight of the city of Bausa. Great was their surprise at finding that town on the mainland, and not, as Clapperton had said, on an island in the Niger. They entered Bausa by the western gate, and were almost immediately introduced to the presence of the king and of the Midiki or queen, who told them that they had both that very morning shed tears over the fate of Clapperton. The Niger or Quora, which flows below the city, was the first object of interest visited by the brothers. This morning, writes the traveller, we visited the far-famed Niger or Quora, which flows by the city about a mile from our residence, and were greatly disappointed at the appearance of this celebrated river. Bleak, rugged rocks rose abruptly from the center of the stream, causing strong ripples and eddies on its surface. It is said that, a few miles above Bausa, the river is divided into 3 branches by 2 small, fertile islands, and that it flows from hence in one continued stream to Funda. The Niger here, in its widest part, is not more than a stone's throw across at present. The rock on which we sat overlooks the spot where Mr. Park and his associates met their unhappy fate. Richard Lander made his preliminary inquiries respecting the books and papers belonging to Mungo Park's expedition with great caution, but presently, reassured by the Sultan's kindness, he determined to question him as to the fate of the explorer. Yarrow was, however, too young at the time of the catastrophe to be able to remember what had occurred. It had taken place 2 reigns back, but he promised to have a search instituted for relics of the illustrious traveller. In the afternoon, says Richard Lander, the king came to see us, followed by a man with a book under his arm, which was said to have been picked up in the Niger after the loss of our countrymen. It was enveloped in a large cotton cloth, and our hearts beat high with expectation as the man was slowly unfolding it, for by its size we guessed it to be Mr. Park's journal. But our disappointment and chagrin were great when, on opening the book, we discovered it to be an old nautical publication of the last century. There was then no further hope of recovering Park's journal. On the 23rd June the Landers left Bausa, filled with gratitude to the king, who had given them valuable presents, and warned them to accept no food, lest it should be poisoned, from any but the governors of the places they should pass through. They travelled alongside of the Niger as far as Kagoji, where they embarked in a wretched native canoe, whilst their horses were sent on by land to Yaouri. We had proceeded only a few hundred yards, says Richard Lander, when the river gradually widened to 2 miles, and continued as far as the eye could reach. It looked very much like an artificial canal, the steep banks confining the water like low walls, with vegetation beyond. In most places the water was extremely shallow, but in others it was deep enough to float a frigate. During the first 2 hours of the day the scenery was as interesting and picturesque as can be imagined. The banks were literally covered with hamlets and villages. Fine trees, bending under the weight of their dark and impenetrable foliage, everywhere relieved the eye from the glare of the sun's rays, and contrasted with the lively verdure of the little hills and plains produced the most pleasing effect. All of a sudden came a total change of scene. To the banks of dark earth, clay, or sand succeeded black, rugged rocks, and that wide mirror which reflected the skies was divided into 1,000 little channels by great sandbanks. A little further on the stream was barred by a wall of black rocks, with a single narrow opening, through which its waters rushed furiously down. At this place there is a portage, above which the Niger flows on, restored to its former breadth, repose, and grandeur. After 3 days' navigation, the Landers reached a village, where they found horses and men waiting for them, and whence they quickly made their way through a continuously hilly country to the town of Yaouri, where they were welcomed by the Sultan, a stout, dirty, slovenly man who received them in a kind of farmyard cleanly kept. The Sultan, who was disappointed that Clapperton had not visited him, and that Richard Lander had omitted to pay his respects on his return journey, was very exacting to his present guests. He would give them none of the provisions they wanted, and did all he could to detain them as long as possible. We may add that food was very dear at Yaouri, and that Richard Lander had no merchandise for barter except a quantity of white-ecapel sharps, warranted not to cut in the eye, for the very good reason, he tells us, that most of them had no eyes at all, so that they were all but worthless. They were able, however, to turn to account some empty tins which had contained soups. The labels, although dirty and tarnished, were much admired by the natives, one of whom strutted proudly about for some days wearing an empty tin on his head, bearing 4 labels of concentrated essence of meat. The Sultan would not permit the Englishmen to enter Nif or Bornu, and told them there was nothing for them but to go back to Bausa. Richard Lander at once wrote to the king of that town, asking permission to buy a canoe in which to go to Funda, as the road by land was infested by plundering fellators. At last, on the 26th July, a messenger arrived from the king of Bausa to inquire into the strange conduct of the Sultan of Yaouri, and the cause of his detention of the white men. After an imprisonment of 5 weeks, the Landers were at last allowed to leave Yaouri, which was now almost entirely inundated. The explorers now ascended the Niger to the confluence of the Kubi, and then went down it again to Bausa, where the king, who was glad to see them again, received them with the utmost cordiality. They were, however, detained longer than they liked by the necessity of paying a visit to the king of Wow, as well as by the difficulty of getting a boat. Moreover, there was some delay in the return of the messengers, who had been sent by the king of Bausa to the different chiefs on the banks of the river. And lastly, Biken Roi, the dark water, had to be consulted in order to ensure the safety of the travellers in their journey to the sea. On taking leave of the king, the brothers were at a loss to express their gratitude for his kindness and hospitality, his zeal in their cause, and the protection he was ever ready to extend during their stay of nearly 2 months in his capital. The natives showed great regret at losing their visitors, and knelt in the path of the brothers, praying with uplifted hands to their gods on their behalf. Now began the descent of the Niger. A halt had to be made at the island of Melili, whose chief begged the white men to accept a very fine kid. We may be sure they were too polite to refuse it. The landers next passed the large town of Kangi, the Songa of Clapperton, and then Ingwazaliji, the rendezvous of merchants travelling between Noof and the districts northeast of Borgu. Below Ingwazaliji they halted at Patashi, a large fertile island of great beauty, planted with palm groves and magnificent trees. As this place was not far from Wow, Richard Lander sent a message to the king of that town, who, however, declined to deliver the canoe which had been purchased of him. The messenger failing in his purpose, the brothers were compelled themselves to visit the king, but as they expected, they got only evasive answers. They had now no choice if they wished to continue their journey, but to make off with the canoes which had been lent them at Patashi. On the 4th October, after further delays, they resumed their course, and being carried down by the current, were soon out of sight of Lever or Leaba, and its wretched inhabitants. The first town the brothers came to was Bajibo, a large and spacious city, which for dirt, noise, and confusion could not be surpassed. Next came Lichi, inhabited by Noof people, and the island of Madge, where the Niger divides into 3 parts. Just beyond, the travellers suddenly found themselves opposite a remarkable rock, 280 feet high, called Mount Kessa, which rises perpendicularly from the centre of the stream. This rock is greatly venerated by the natives, who believe it to be the favourite home of a beneficent genius. Mount Kessa. Mount Kessa. Facsimile of early engraving. At Beli, a little above Rabba, the brothers received a visit from the king of the dark waters, chief of the island of Zagoshi, who appeared in a canoe of great length and unusual cleanliness, decked with scarlet cloth and gold lace. On the same day they reached the town of Zagoshi, opposite Rabba, and the second Felata town beyond Sakatu. Malam Dendo, chief of Zagoshi, was a cousin of Bello. He was a blind and very feeble old man in very bad health, who knew he had but a few years longer to reign, and his one thought was how best to secure the throne to his son. Although he had received very costly presents, Malam Dendo was anything but satisfied, and declared that if the travellers did not make him other and more valuable gifts, he would require their guns, pistols, and powder, before he allowed them to leave Zagoshi. Richard Lander did not know what to do, when the gift of the tobe or robe of Mungo Park, which had been restored by the king of Bausa, threw Malam Dendo into such ecstasies of joy that he declared himself the protector of the Europeans, promised to do all he could to help them to reach the sea, made them a present of several richly coloured plated mats, 2 bags of rice, and a bunch of bananas. These stores came just in time, for the whole stock of cloth, looking-glasses, razors, and pipes was exhausted, and the English had nothing left but a few needles and some silver bracelets as presents for the chiefs on the banks of the Niger. Rabba, says Lander, seen from Zagoshi, appears to be a large, compact, clean, and well-built town, though it is unwalled and is not otherwise fenced. It is irregularly built on the slope of a gently rising hill, at the foot of which runs the Niger, and in point of rank, population, and wealth, it is the second city in the Felata dominions, Sakatu alone being considered as its superior. It is inhabited by a mixed population of Felatas, Nifians, and emigrants and slaves from various countries, and is governed by a ruler who exercises sovereign authority over Rabba and its dependencies, and is styled Sultan or King. Rabba is famous for milk, oil, and honey. The market, when our messengers were there, appeared to be well supplied with bullocks, horses, mules, asses, sheep, goats, and abundance of poultry, rice and various sorts of corn, cotton cloth, indigo, saddles and bridles made of red and yellow leather, besides shoes, boots, and sandals, were offered for sale in great plenty. Although we observed about 200 slaves for sale, none had been disposed of when we left the market in the evening. Rabba is not very famous for the number or variety of its artificers, and yet in the manufacture of mats and sandals it is unrivaled. However, in all other handicrafts, Rabba yields to Zagoshi. The industry and love of labor displayed by the people of the latter town were an agreeable surprise in this lazy country. Its inhabitants, who are hospitable and obliging, are protected by the situation of their island against the Felatas. They are independent too, and recognize no authority but that of the king of the dark waters, whom they obey because it is to their interest to do so. On the 16th October, the landers at last started in a wretched canoe, for which the king had made them pay a high price, with paddles they had stolen, because no one would sell them any. This was the first time they had been able to embark on the Niger without help from the natives. They went down the river, whose width varies greatly, avoiding large towns as much as possible, for they had no means of satisfying the extortions of the chiefs. No incident of note occurred before Ega was reached, if we except a terrible storm which overtook the travellers when, unable to land in the marshes bordering the river, they had allowed their boat to drift with the current, and during which they were all but upset by the hippopotam playing about on the surface of the water. All this time the Niger flowed in an ESE direction, now 8, now only 2 miles in width. The current was so rapid that the boat went at the rate of 4 or 5 miles an hour. They were all but upset. On the 19th October the landers passed the mouth of the Caledonia, which Richard had crossed near Cutup on his first expedition, and a little later they came in sight of Ega. The landing place was soon reached by way of a bay encumbered with an immense number of large and heavy canoes full of merchandise, with the prows daubed with blood, and covered with feathers, as charms against thieves. The chief, to whom the travellers were at once conducted, was an old man with a long white beard, whose appearance would have been venerable and patriarchal had he not laughed and played in quite a childish manner. The natives assembled in hundreds to see the strange-looking visitors, and the latter had to place 3 men as sentinels outside their door to keep the curious at a distance. Square stool belonging to the King of Bornu. Facsimile of early engraving. Lander says that Benin and Portuguese cloths are sold at Ega by many of its inhabitants, so that it would appear that some kind of communication is kept up between the sea coast and this place. The people are very speculative and enterprising, and numbers of them employ all their time solely in trading up and down the Niger. They live entirely in their canoes, over which they have a shed, that answers completely every purpose for which it is intended, so that in their constant peregrinations they have no need of any other dwelling or shelter than that which their canoes afford them. Their belief, says Lander, that we possessed the power of doing anything we wished was at first amusing enough, but their importunities went so far that they became annoying. They applied to us for charms to avert wars and other national calamities, to make them rich, to prevent the crocodiles from carrying off the people, and for the chief of the fishermen to catch a canoe-load of fish every day, each request being accompanied with some sort of present, such as country beer, goronuts, coconuts, lemons, yams, rice, and sea, in quantity proportionate to the value of their request. The curiosity of the people to see us is so intense that we dare not stir out of doors, and therefore we are compelled to keep our door open all day long for the benefit of the air, and the only exercise which we can take is by walking round and round our hut like wild beasts in a cage. The people stand gazing at us with visible emotions of amazement and terror. We are regarded, in fact, in just the same light as the fiercest tigers in Europe. If we venture to approach too near the doorway, they rush backwards in a state of the greatest alarm and trepidation, but when we are at the opposite side of the hut they draw as near as their fears will permit them, in silence and caution. Ega is a town of vast extent, and its population must be immense. Like all the towns on the banks of the Niger, it is inundated every year. We can but conclude that the natives have their own reasons for building their houses in situations which, in our eyes, are alike so inconvenient and unhealthy. Perhaps it may be because the soil of the surrounding districts consists of a black, greasy mould of extraordinary fertility, supplying all the necessaries of life at the cost of very little trouble. Although the king of Ega looked more than 100 years old, he was very gay and light-hearted. The chief people of the town met in his hut and spent whole days in conversation. This company of greybeards, for they are all old, laugh so heartily at the sprightliness of their own wit, that it is an invariable practice, when anyone passes by, to stop and listen outside, and they add to their noisy merriment so much good will that we hear nothing from the hut in which the aged group are revelling during the day but loud peals of laughter and shouts of applause. One day the old chief wished to show off his accomplishments of singing and dancing, expecting to astonish his visitors. He frisked, says Lander, beneath the burden of 50, and shaking his hoary locks, capered over the ground to the manifest delight of the bystanders, whose plaudits, though confined, as they always are, to laughter, yet tickled the old man's fancy to that degree that he was unable to keep up his dance any longer without the aid of a crutch. With its assistance he hobbled on a little while, but his strength failed him. He was constrained for the time to give over, and he set himself down at our side on the threshold of the hut. He would not acknowledge his weakness to us for the world, but endeavoured to pant silently, and suppress loud breathings that we might not hear him. How ridiculous, yet how natural, is this vanity! He made other unavailing attempts to dance, and also made an attempt to sing, but nature would not second his efforts, and his weak piping voice was scarcely audible. The singers, dancers, and musicians continued their noisy mirth, till we were weary of looking at and listening to them, and as bedtime was drawing near, we desired them to depart, to the infinite regret of the frivolous but merry old chief. Malamdendo, however, tried to dissuade the English from continuing the descent of the river. Ega, he said, was the last Noof town. The power of the Felatas extended no further, and between it and the sea dwelt none but savage and barbarous races, always at war with each other. These rumours and the stories told by the natives to the landers people of the danger they would run of being murdered or sold as slaves so terrified the latter that they refused to embark, declaring their intention of going back to Cape Coast Castle by the way that they came. Thanks to the firmness of the brothers, this mutiny was quelled, and on the 22nd October the explorers left Ega, firing a parting salute of 3 musket shots. A few miles further down, a seagull flew over their heads, a sure sign that they were approaching the sea, and with it appeared all but certain the end of their wearisome journey. Several small and wretched villages, half under water, and a large town at the foot of a mountain, which looked ready to overwhelm it, the name of which the travellers could not learn, were passed in succession. They met a great number of canoes built like those on the Barney and Calabar rivers. The crews stared in astonishment at the white men whom they dared not address. The low marshy banks of the Niger were now gradually exchanged for loftier, richer, and more fertile districts. Kakunda, where the people of Ega had recommended Lander to halt, is on the western bank of the river. From a distance its appearance is singularly picturesque. The natives were at first alarmed at the appearance of the travellers. An old Malam acting as Mohammedan priest and schoolmaster took them under his protection, and, thanks to him, the brothers received a warm welcome in the capital of the independent kingdom of Noof. The information collected in this town, or rather in this group of 4 villages, coincided with that obtained at Ega. Richard Lander therefore resolved to make the rest of the voyage by night, and to load his 4 remaining guns and 2 pistols with balls and shot. To the great astonishment of the natives, who could not understand such contempt of danger, the explorers left Kakunda with 3 loud cheers, committing their cause to the hands of God. They passed several important towns which they avoided. The river now wound a great deal, flowing from the south to southeast, and then to the southwest between lofty hills. On the 25th October, the English found themselves opposite the mouth of a large river. It was the Tichada or Benue. At its junction with the Niger is an important town called Kutum Curafi. After a narrow escape from being swallowed up in a whirlpool and crushed against the rocks, Lander, having found a suitable spot showing signs of habitation, determined to land. That this place had been visited a little time previously was proved by 2 burnt-out fires with some broken calabashes, fragments of earthenware vessels, cocoanut shells, staves of powder barrels, and which the travellers picked up with some emotion, for they proved that the natives had had dealings with Europeans. Some women ran away out of a village which 3 of Lander's men entered with a view to get the materials for a fire. The exhausted explorers were resting on mats when they were suddenly surrounded by a crowd of half-naked men armed with guns, bows and arrows, cutlasses, iron barbs and spears. The coolness and presence of mind of the brothers alone averted a struggle, the issue of which could not be dubious. As we approached, says Lander, we made all the signs and motions we could with our arms to deter the chief and his people from firing on us. His quiver was dangling at his side, his bow was bent, and an arrow which was pointed at our breasts already trembled on the string when we were within a few yards of his person. This was a highly critical moment, the next might be our last, but the hand of Providence averted the blow, for just as the chief was about to pull the fatal cord, a man that was nearest him rushed forward and stayed his arm. At that instant we stood before him and immediately held forth our hands. All of them trembled like aspen leaves. The chief looked up full in our faces, kneeling on the ground. Light seemed to flash from his dark, rolling eyes, his body was convulsed all over as though he were enduring the utmost torture, and with a timorous yet undefinable expression of countenance, in which all the passions of our nature were strangely blended, he drooped his head eagerly, grasped our proffered hands, and burst into tears. This was a sign of friendship. Harmony followed, and war and bloodshed were thought of no more. It was happy for us that our white faces and calm behavior produced the effect it did on these people. In another minute our bodies would have been as full of arrows as a porcupine's is full of quills. "I thought you were children of heaven fallen from the skies," said the chief, in explanation of this sudden change. This scene took place in the famous market town of Bakwa, of which the travellers had so often heard, whither the people come up from the coast to exchange the merchandise of the whites for slaves brought in large numbers from Funda, on the opposite bank. The information obtained at Bakwa was most satisfactory. The sea was only 10 days' journey off. There was no danger in going down the river, the chief said, though the people on the banks were a bad lot. Following the advice of this chief, the travellers passed the fine town of Atar without stopping, and halted at Abagaka, where the river divides into several branches, and whose chief showed insatiable greed, refusing to halt at several villages, whose inhabitants begged for a sight of the white strangers. They were finally obliged to land at the village of Damugo, where a little man wearing a waistcoat which had once formed part of a uniform hailed them in English, crying out, "Halloa ho, you English, come here." He was an emissary from the king of Barney come to buy slaves for the master. The chief of Damugo, who had never before seen white men, received the explorers very kindly, held public rejoicings in their honor, and detained them with constant fetes until the 4th November. Although the fetish consulted by him presaged that they would meet with 1,000 dangers before reaching the sea, this monarch supplied them with an extra canoe, some rowers, and a guide. Map of the lower course of the Jaliba, Kwara or Niger. Grave Pa e Morio. The sinister predictions of the fetish were soon fulfilled. John and Richard Lander were embarked in different boats. As they passed a large town called Curry, they were stopped by war canoes, each containing 40 men wearing European clothes, minus the trousers. Each canoe carried what at first sight appeared to be the Union Jack flying from a long bamboo cane fixed in the stern. A 4 or 6 pounder was lashed to each prow, and every black sailor was provided with a musket. The two brothers were taken to Curry, where a palaver was held upon their fate. Fortunately, the Malams or Mohammedan priests interfered in their favor, and some of their property was restored to them, but the best part had gone to the bottom of the river with John Lander's canoe. "To my great satisfaction," says Lander, "I immediately recognized the box containing our books and one of my brother's journals. The medicine chest was by its side, but both were filled with water. A large carpet bag containing all our wearing apparel was lying cut open, and deprived of its contents, with the exception of a shirt, a pair of trousers, and a waistcoat. Many valuable articles which it had contained were gone. The whole of my journal, with the exception of a notebook with remarks from Rabba to this place, was lost. 4 guns, one of which had been the property of the late Mr. Park, 4 cutlasses and 2 pistols were gone. 9 elephants' tusks, the finest I had seen in the country, which had been given us by the kings of Wow Wow and Bausa. A quantity of ostrich feathers, some handsome leopard skins, a great variety of seeds, all our buttons, carries, and needles, which were necessary for us to purchase provisions with, all were missing, and said to have been sunk in the river. This was like going down in port, after crossing Africa from Badagry to Bausa, escaping all the dangers of navigating the Niger, getting free from the hands of so many rapacious chiefs, to be shipwrecked 6 days' journey from the sea, to be made slaves of or condemned to death, just on the eve of making known to Europe the results of so many sufferings endured, so many dangers escaped, so many obstacles happily surmounted, to have traced the course of the Niger from Bausa, to be on the point of determining the exact position of its mouth, and then to find themselves stopped by wretched pirates was really too much, and bitter indeed were the reflections of the brothers during the interminable palaver upon their fate. Although their stolen property was partially restored to them, and the Negro who had begun the attack upon them was condemned to be beheaded, the brothers were none the less regarded as prisoners, and they were marched off to Obi, king of the country, who would decide what was to be done with them. It was evident that the robbers were not natives of the country, but had only entered it with a view to pillage. They probably counted on trading in 2 or 3 such market towns as Curry if they did not meet with any boats, but such as were too strong to be plundered. For the rest, all the tribes of this part of the Niger seemed to be at daggers drawn with each other, and the trade in provisions was carried on under arms. After 2 days' row, the canoes came in sight of Ebo, at a spot where the stream divides into 3 rivers of great width, with marshy level banks covered with palm trees. An hour later, one of the boatmen, a native of Ebo, cried, "There is my country." Here fresh difficulties awaited the travellers. Obi, king of Ebo, a young man with a refined and intelligent countenance, received the white men with cordiality. His dress, which reminded his visitors of that of the king of Yariba, was adorned with such a quantity of coral that he might have been called the Coral King. Obi seemed to be affected by the account the English gave of the struggle in which they had lost all their merchandise, but the aid he gave them was by no means proportioned to the warmth of the sentiments which he expressed. Indeed, he let them all but die of hunger. The Igbo people, says the narrative, like most Africans, are extremely indolent, and cultivate yams, Indian corn and plantains only. They have abundance of goats and fowls, but few sheep are to be seen and no bullocks. The city, which has no other name than the Igbo country, is situated on an open plain. It is immensely large, contains a vast population, and is the capital of a kingdom of the same name. It has, for a series of years, been the principal slave mart for native traders from the coast, between the Bani and Old Calabar rivers, and for the production of its palm oil, it has obtained equal celebrity. Hundreds of men from the rivers mentioned above come up for the purpose of trade, and numbers of them are at present residing in canoes in front of the town. Most of the oil purchased by Englishmen at the Bani and adjacent rivers is brought from thence, as are nearly all the slaves which are annually exported from those places by the French, Spaniards, and Portuguese. It has been told us by many that the Igbo people are confirmed anthropophagy, and this opinion is more prevalent among the tribes bordering on that kingdom than with the natives of more remote districts. From what the travellers could learn, it was pretty certain that Obi would not let them go without exacting a considerable ransom. He may doubtless have been driven to this by the importunity of his favourites, but it was more likely the result of the greed of the people of Bani and Brass, who quarrelled as to which tribe should carry off the English to their country. A son of the chief of Bani, King Pepper, a native named Gun, brother of King Boy, and their father King Forde, who with King Jacket governed the whole of the Brass country, were the most eager in their demands, and produced as proofs of their honourable intentions the testimonials given to them by the European captains with whom they had business relations. One of these documents, signed James Dow, captain of the brig Susan of Liverpool, and dated from the most important river of the Brass country, September 1830, ran thus. Captain Dow states that he never met with a set of greater scoundrels than the natives generally, and the pilots in particular. It goes on in a similar strain, heaping curses upon the natives, and charging them with having endeavoured to wreck Dow's vessel at the mouth of the river, with a view to dividing his property amongst them. King Jacket was designated as an errant rogue and a desperate thief. Boy was the only one of common honesty or trustworthiness. After an endless palaver, Obi declared that according to the laws and customs of the country, he had a right to look upon the landers and their people as his property, but that, not wishing to abuse his privileges, he would set them free in exchange for the value of 20 slaves in English merchandise. This decision, which Richard Lander tried in vain to shake, plunged the brothers into the depths of despair, a state of mind soon succeeded by an apathy and indifference so complete that they could not have made the faintest effort to recover their liberty. Add to these mental sufferings the physical weakness to which they were reduced by want of food, and we shall have some idea of their state of prostration. Without resources of any kind, robbed of their needles, cowries, and merchandise, they were reduced to the sad necessity of begging their bread. But we might as well have addressed our petitions to the stones or trees, says Lander. We might have spared ourselves the mortification of a refusal. We never experienced a more stinging sense of our own humbleness and imbecility than on such occasions, and never had we greater need of patience and lowliness of spirit. In most African towns and villages we have been regarded as demigods, and treated in consequence with universal kindness, civility, and veneration. But here, alas, what a contrast! We are classed with the most degraded and despicable of mankind, and are become slaves in a land of ignorance and barbarism, whose savage natives have treated us with brutality and contempt. It was Boy who finally achieved the rescue of the Landers, for he consented to pay to Obi the ransom he demanded for them and their people. Boy himself was very moderate, asking for nothing in return for his trouble and the risk he ran in taking the white men to Brass, but 15 bars or 15 slaves, and a barrel of rum. Although this demand was exorbitant, Lander did not hesitate to write an order on Richard Lake, captain of an English vessel at anchor in Brass River, for 36 bars. The king's canoe on which the brothers embarked on the 12th November carried 60 persons, 40 of whom were rowers. It was hollowed out of a single tree trunk, measured more than 50 feet long, carried a 4-pounder in the prow, an arsenal of cutlasses and grape shot, and was laden with merchandise of every kind. The vast tracts of cultivated land on either side of the river showed that the population was far more numerous than would have been supposed. The scenery was flat, open, and varied, and the soil, a rich black mold, produced luxuriant trees and green shrubs of every shade. At 7 p.m. on the 11th November, the canoe left the chief branch of the Niger and entered the Brass River. An hour later, Richard Lander recognized with inexpressible delight tidal waves. It was hollowed out of a single tree trunk. A little farther on, Boy's canoe came up with those of Gunn and Forday. The latter was a venerable-looking old man, in spite of his wretched semi-European semi-native clothing, and a very strong predilection for rum, of which he consumed a great quantity, although his manners and conversation betrayed no signs of excessive drinking. That was a strange escort which accompanied the 2 Englishmen as far as the town of Brass. The canoes, says Lander, were following each other up the river in tolerable order, each of them displaying 3 flags. In the first was King Boy, standing erect and conspicuous, his headdress of feathers waving with the movements of his body, which had been chalked in various fantastic figures, rendered more distinct by its natural colour. His hands were resting on the barbs of 2 immense spears, which at intervals he darted violently into the bottom of the canoe, as if he were in the act of killing some formidable wild animal under his feet. In the bows of all the other canoes fetish priests were dancing, and performing various extraordinary antics, their persons, as well as those of the people with them, being chalked over in the same manner as that of King Boy. And to crown the whole, Mr. Gunn, the little military gentleman, was most actively employed, his canoe now darting before and now dropping behind the rest, adding not a little to the imposing effect of the whole scene by the repeated discharges of his cannon. Brass consists of 2 towns, one belonging to Forday, the other to King Jacket. The priests performed some curious ceremonies before disembarking, evidently having reference to the whites. Was the result of the consultation of the fetish of the town favourable or not to the visitors? The way the natives treated them would answer that question. Before he set foot on land, Richard Lander, to his great delight, recognized a white man on the banks. He was the captain of a Spanish schooner at anchor in the river. The narrative goes on to say, "Of all the wretched, filthy, and contemptible places in this world of ours, none can present to the eye of a stranger so miserable an appearance, or can offer such disgusting and loathsome sights, as this abominable Brass town. Dogs, goats, and other animals run about the dirty streets half-starved, whose hungry looks can only be exceeded by the famishing appearance of the men, women, and children, which bespeaks the penury and wretchedness to which they are reduced, whilst the persons of many of them are covered with odious boils, and their huts are falling to the ground from neglect and decay.